Thank you to all of the moderators for doing such a tremendous job, not only in pulling together the speakers and the topics, but also paying attention and summarizing everything that that had been said during these sessions. And not only that, but also taking us further into developing actionable steps for the future, so that when we are pulling together this meeting in 2 years or 5 years, we can look back and say, yes, all of these things have been accomplished. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Gwen to lead the question and answer period.
Great. Thank you, Larissa. And I think we're both standing because we're in the action part now. And so the standing is giving us energy to facilitate an action discussion. So I wanted to just echo Larissa's thanks to everybody. This has been really, this has been so illuminating in terms of raising the issues and really articulating the issues that we're facing, the root causes and the issues as we develop this, as we try to develop an evidence base, and really looking at the strategies and solutions. And so what we're going to do now is take that, take those, what everybody has been outlining and what the moderators have summarized, and really focus on what an action plan would look like and how we get to an action plan. And I would say, and everybody, there was a little bit of a chat about this right before the meeting, that one of the things that has stood out to everybody, and Monica also reinforced this, was the idea that there's an ethical issue here of treating patients without the evidence to show that those treatments are effective, that they meet patient goals, that they meet family and community goals. And so this, in fact, gives us the moral imperative and the moral impetus to look at this in a very action-oriented way, because we have to solve that question. We have to solve the issue of treating people with evidence that shows what we are treating them with is not going to harm them. And so I actually wanted to first frame it with that ethical imperative, because I think if we keep that in mind, that really helps us. That's sort of that's our through line in everything that we're talking about. But I would like to start off, normally we end the panel by asking people to give a summary or one step, but I'd like to start off by asking the moderators to talk about what would be their priority action step from as we move towards improving this evidence base. And I'm looking straight at Monica, so I'm going to ask Monica to just.
Okay, well, I'm very happy to go first. I'm going to say, I'm going to take this one personally. Okay, I'm going to take this challenge personally. As some of you may know, I'm the group chair of the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, one of the NCI-funded cancer cooperative groups. What I am going to do and we have within our group, started by Rich Shilsky, a Cancer in the Older Adults Committee that has done a fantastic job putting out tools and teaching us how to study, how to include older adults. But it's time for all of Alliance to look at every single study we do, to examine the proportion of older adults that make up that target study population, and to design those studies in ways that facilitate adequate enrollment of those patients in the studies. And so I'm taking that on as my personal goal and challenge on behalf of the Alliance.
Great, thank you, Monica. Rich, your microphone's off. Let me call on you.
Oh, thanks, Gwen. Well, I want to focus on what we keep saying is the core of the problem, which is that doctors don't offer participation in clinical trials to older people. We've had a lot of discussion about how to modify the trials and how to modify the regulatory framework. But if the real problem is doctors don't offer participation, then we have to think about how to provide incentives to doctors to do that. We've done work in the past through CLGB and Alliance that has shown that if you simply try to provide educational materials to doctors, it doesn't really move the needle very much. So, we can try to educate, but without some incentive, it's probably not going to happen. So what can we do? So in my presentation in session 3, I talked about, the notion of creating CPT codes that would pay doctors at a higher rate for managing patients on clinical trials. That's not limited to older individuals, but it would certainly help to enroll all patients in clinical trials, because it would compensate physicians better for the extra time spent to manage those individuals. There are other things that could possibly be done. These are some of my own personal thoughts about this, but we didn't talk really at all about meaningful use criteria, and which also directly relates to physician reimbursement, and whether or not meaningful use criteria, which we generally agree are not terribly meaningful the way they were originally constructed, could be revisited to require data entry that actually gets the information into the medical record that we want to have for post-marketing studies. We may have to work hard with the medical record providers to modify EHRs to simplify and facilitate data entry on the key outcome measures that are thought to be meaningful, particularly for older adults. And then I think there are, other things that might be able to be done. As most everybody knows, ASCO, for example, operates a number of quality programs, and our COPE certification program in particular provides certification to practices that they are delivering high quality cancer care. It does not include an assessment regarding participation in clinical trials. It does not include any assessment about, for example, use of geriatric assessment tools in managing older patients. Could it be modified to include those things? It could, and that may be an action item that ASCO wants to revisit, particularly since we're at a point now where we are, in fact, revising many of our quality initiatives. And then the final comment I'll just make briefly in response to the challenge that I think Heidi put on the table to ASCO to modify its editorial policies for its journals. That could certainly be done, but I think the group that actually has the lever here is the ICMJE, the International Council of Medical Journal Editors. That is a group that represents the editors of all of the most high impact factor journals in medicine. If they adopt a policy to say that they will not publish a clinical trial that does not include data elements relevant to older populations, you will start to see those data elements appearing in those clinical trial publications. They've already put out, a requirement for, that every clinical trial has to have a data sharing policy, and lo and behold, the authors are putting forward data sharing policies. So I think that's a group that has leverage, and that's a group that we might be able to work with.
And thank you, Rich. And I think you've mentioned a number of times that the idea that if the physician doesn't ask, obviously the patient isn't going to participate. And so often we talk about patients being unwilling to participate, but the data shows that if they're asked, they will, including in Black and African American populations are actually more willing to participate in clinical trials than Caucasian populations. So people have to be asked. Physicians have to feel as if it is part of what they need to do. And I think the incentivizing, can't say that word. The incentivizing is crucial to this. As well as talking about the different stakeholders that Larissa had highlighted in her opening remarks. I think that we heard about some of the stakeholders in the first two answers to these questions. Does Ishwarya, do you want to respond to this?
So there are many elements of Dr. Shilsky's comments that resonated with many of us. And he can say that because he's retiring in a few weeks, I suppose. But the rest of us are equally invested in this. And
carry on. You have to carry on.
Fair enough. So it is a multidimensional issue, right? If there's one thing we've seen is every stakeholder in the oncologic table, or as many as possible, was represented over the past 3 days of this event. And you heard directly from them what the issues are. In the summary session, you saw the common themes come through. For someone listening to this, none of this should be surprising, right? We know all of this. Why hasn't anything happened? Up to this point, it's a system that's been built on altruism and requests and guidance versus one that emphasizes accountability, responsibility, and mandate/requirement. And so we're at that point where if we really do want to see change, we have to transition from academic discourse to legislation and the journal hardball, as Dr. Shilsky has said quite openly. It is a multidimensional problem. It needs a multidimensional solution, and a solution that's rooted in legislation. I think it starts with expanding the authority of the FDA to be able to actually mandate some of these requirements versus offering as a suggestion. The reality is that for a trial's participant population to not represent the intended population or the demographics of that disease is unacceptable. And to give the FDA the legislative authority to mandate that the participants are within an acceptable range of who the patients actually are is not a reach. It's not an over ask. And so it makes sense for that to be an advocacy priority.
And I would also just go back to what Rebecca Pence said. It's not just unacceptable, but it's unethical. And I think that really, if we lead with what's ethical and what our moral imperative is, that really helps drive and pull all the stakeholders into this, into moving in the same direction. Would anybody else like to comment on this?
Yeah, Gwen, this is Randy. I would.
Hi, Randy.
Hi, I want to follow Monica's lead. She mentioned, her connection with Alliance. I'm going to look at this from the community oncology perspective and my work with the Association for Community Cancer Centers. I want to link a few things. Most cancer patients in the United States get their care in the community, right? Clinical trials are inadequately represented in the community. As Rich mentioned, ACCC and ASCO are working together to bring clinical trials into the community, particularly for Black and other represented people. We talked about geriatrics as well. We thought that initially was too big of a chunk to bite off at once. But I think that the community is where it's where people live their post-marketing lives, right? It's where their survival is. So I think it behooves community oncology to be doing the geriatric assessment and to be gathering the information that goes into the composite endpoints that patients can answer the question whether it was worth it for the trial. I'm going to suggest that maybe at the community level and maybe even through the COC, the Commission on Cancer, that it becomes a requirement. The COC advanced survivorship programs, why shouldn't we all be having geriatric oncology programs or geriatric assessments over the entire lifespan of our care of a patient?
And that's a really important point that came up throughout the entire workshop, was where patients are treated and how we build the evidence base through the collaboration of patients and their healthcare providers in the community. Eric Rubin, would you, can I ask you to comment on this from an industry perspective?
Sure, Gwen. So I think while it's been stated that I think, a lot of the things we've been discussing over the past 3 days for this session are not necessarily new, I'm not so sure for the overall, ecosphere of including industry and academicians, of people who put together clinical trials and drug development plans, that's true. And so I think that, it's important to make sure that the points made here are disseminated, including amongst industry colleagues. And, there is hope, I think. Part of this is, again, I think there's a tendency for folks to design trials the same way they've always designed them. And, a couple things that that I think demonstrate there can be change. One Don will like. I remember back when I was prescribed or writing chemotherapy orders, everything was always body surface area based dosing, which really made no sense. But it was stuck, and again, industry was complicit in this, because when they designed their trials, because everyone always used BSA based dosing, it ended up stuck in the trial. And with efforts from Don and others, we eventually got rid of that. And I think it's I hardly ever see that anymore. And we've tried to simplify dosing regimens. I think the same, I would say for some of the older eligibility criteria that we've discussed, some of which, again, can hamper enrollment of older patients, that, again, are legacy eligibility criteria that have ended up they keep getting passed on through generations. But again, through efforts from ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research and FDA, I do think that industry-based trials now are starting to relax those criteria. And so I think the same can happen with enrollment of older patient populations if we sort of continue the momentum that has been established over the past 3 days.
Great. Thank you, Eric. And I wrote down the legacy eligibility criteria, because I think that's also been a theme throughout this workshop, and how that relates to what is important to patients and questions that matter to patients in terms of quality of life and disease burden. So I think that's a really important point that has just been a theme throughout every single one of these sessions. I know Heidi wanted to make a comment. So Heidi.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make one overarching comment. I completely agree with all of the comments so far. We've heard a lot of solutions that could be enacted now. So many sponsors have levers that they could pull now. And I think, the big picture is, just as Monica brought up, the Alliance can do something now. FDA is doing something and can do more now without even the hope for a legislative mandate. NCI can do more now. Journals can do more now. And I think if every one of these levers is pulled, and we create an expectation that the bar is set, that the expectation is that you enroll older adults proportional to the disease based on SEER data with X confidence interval, that you include basic metrics of very simple measures in each clinical trial. Here's your template. If the expectation is set and everyone pulls their lever and creates that expectation in whatever way they can, I think we're going to see change. And we didn't mention, expectations set for comprehensive cancer centers, right? So what is your enrollment? So every comprehensive cancer center, when they go in for their renewal, is looking at their metrics and their set of expectations. They should be there. And I realize that there are expectations now based on age, but are there levers that can be pulled? So we should be turning things on their head so that we're no longer saying, gosh, you should do these things if you can, but it's hard. It's not that hard. We've shown that it can be done. Every expectation, the bar should be set in every one of these settings, so people just do it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Heidi. And I think, it's clear that there are things we can do now. We don't have to that's why we wanted to talk about action steps rather than just what we have to get to the urgency of now. And I think that's what is going to be so critical about this workshop, and what has been brought up by all the panelists and moderators is what can we do urgently now, as well as taking a longer view. So would anybody else like to comment?
I just wanted to say that one thing I really appreciated about this particular workshop was that, because again, we discussions like this before. I mean, I think, Eric, we have been talking about this forever, from my perspective, but maybe it just feels that way. But one thing I've really appreciated here is the focus on the life cycle of a drug, right? Because I do think that industry on some level sometimes may not know exactly what to do. And when we're only talking about the registration trial, it leaves out opportunities on the other end of drug development, like modeling, like PK/PD modeling for dosing and age, and like the post-marketing data that could contribute to knowledge about new drugs. I do think we have to remember, in a regulatory environment, in a cancer, in a life-threatening disease, there are kind of checks and balances around getting out these life-saving, life-extending drugs in an expeditious fashion. And so kind of looking at the life cycle of the drug and trying to get all this data throughout the life cycle and having kind of several bites at the apple, if you will, I think is a really important strategy to kind of pull into this that I think this workshop did really well. The other thing I want to mention, and it's kind of come up several times before, but I think it's really important to harness the movement that is ongoing in our country around racial and ethnic representation. And many of the principles we've discussed here do directly apply. And so, when we move forward to talk with companies and investigators and, cooperative groups, should all of this be, should these be discussed in parallel and tandem, and would that add more kind of momentum potentially? And certainly each can stand alone, but I think we would be remiss to kind of not recognize what's going on and see how older adult community could gain.
Yeah, thank you, Harpreet. That's certainly an imperative. And one of the things that hasn't been brought up yet is this. It is the notion of what are the barriers to patient participation. In this final session, it was brought up all throughout the workshop. So I think we shouldn't lose that as we're looking at the action steps. So for example, at the Patient Advocate Foundation, where we provide direct patient services to patients who are primarily low-income, underinsured, very ethnically and racially diverse, the number one reason they call us is for transportation, is for barriers of transportation, and that's come up over and over again. So I'd like to turn it over to Larissa to take up the baton of questioning.
So great discussion so far. So I just wanted to actually go back to a point that Randy made, and anyone who knows me would not be surprised that I'm making this point, which is that most patients, especially elderly cancer patients, are getting their care in the community. And most of them are also much more closely aligned with their primary care physicians. And often we'll go to their primary care physicians and we'll ask them questions. What do you think I should do? So I think that as we're considering who are the stakeholders here, especially for the geriatric population, we definitely do need to think of the primary care physicians as well as the other specialists that many of our patients see, and they have developed very long-term relationships with those patients and can actually have a role to play in saying, yeah, you should do this, or, I don't think that this would necessarily work for you. So I just wanted to be sure to make that plug here. And then, taking sort of cue from what Gwen said, which is patient barriers. And, we've all been thinking about, what are the lessons learned from the pandemic, and how do we move forward by taking some of the lessons learned during the pandemic. And so clearly the piece about remote care and telemedicine and, the various tools that we've always had available to us, but we never seem to use them. I'm wondering if everyone on the panel could comment on, what are the ways that we can learn from the pandemic in guiding enrollment of elderly patients in our clinical trials. And I'll start with, let's say, Aishwarya.
Sounds good. So the amazing thing about this pandemic is that, we've had telemedicine task forces that have been there for years within the institution. And then suddenly in a 3-week period, all of a sudden, what was moving along at a cruise ship pace is now at a speedboat pace. And so nothing was a greater facilitator of adoption of innovation than the COVID-19 pandemic. So it proved to us that we can take care of patients even if they're not in front of us. We can provide high quality care for those patients that when they're not in front of us. The data is still maturing, but within our experience in our own center, the adoption of telehealth amongst older adults was equal to that of those in the middle-age cohort. So there shouldn't be an assumption of a technologic barrier for older adults specifically. That being said, there are factors that go into it. So you just have to be mindful of the needs of the older adult. So people can be engaged for good visits technologically through the virtual platform. People are fully capable of getting labs closer to home and sending the results. But in order to do that, we had to go through quite a bit of regulatory paperwork, including getting the CLIA certification of the lab that's down the street from them, sending it to the sponsor. Never mind the domain of non-standard lab tests. How are we going to pay for those? What's the logistics of that? These onerous details are the real barriers, right? And when you get down to it, on how to facilitate care closer to home. And so those who are responsible for setting the regulations of certifying a lab or certifying that the following test results will be acceptable in a clinical trial protocol need to get on a teleconference and make a decision that, yes, you can get labs done at home, and no, we don't need to get the latest CLIA certification of that lab, within 24 hours or whatever the rule may be. These are changes that the pandemic has facilitated. And I would argue that we provide better care because we see patients in their natural habitat, if you will. I know who's at home with them. I know what type of support they have. I can see what their needs are in a way that is not, that I couldn't before. And that helps in decision-making when it comes to treatment selection as well as toxicity management. If the life cycle of your drug starts off with a characterization of the toxicity profile, you really want to take care of that patient in their home setting. So I'll pause there.
Fabulous. I'm wondering if any of the others can comment on their experiences, particularly with clinical care, but also the potential of enrolling patients into clinical trials and also doing some patient-reported outcome follow-up and assessment of symptoms and other innovative ways that actually have always been there. We just haven't used them.
So I'll just jump in and just highlight one point, in particular from clinical care, but we've seen it in our clinical trials, is the importance of having some flexibility, particularly around, for example, telemedicine. So some of my older adults, want a video visit. Many of them don't. So you would think phone visits would not be desirable because of the prevalence of hearing impairment. And yet I have many patients who prefer that as their modality, and it goes either way. It's a little bit hard to predict. And I think it just speaks to the importance of sort of building in, both in clinical practice now, but also in clinical trials, a greater degree of flexibility in areas where it's not a safety issue. Because the more flexibility we have, the more likely we are to not just enroll, but also retain, and collect data in a timely manner. And, it just opens up just a tremendous opportunity with respect to increasing the quality of our data collection as we get more data through, PRO data via televisits, for example. So I think there's a great opportunity here, but just speaking to the flexibility, it goes across all aspects of our trial design, including this.
The other thing I think from my clinical practice that I've noticed is As those of us who take care of older patients know, the visit the patient is often accompanied by their child, and who often will need to take time off from work in order to accompany their parent to a visit. And so what I've definitely found, over the pandemic is that follow-up is also easier. And I feel like there is sort of a greater sense of relief among the grown children of our patients who either don't have to take off, from work and kind of, schlep their parent to the visit, but also can accompany their parent to the visit via the virtual space.
Larissa, this is Rich. I might mention one other thing that may be germane to this conversation. So first of all, hopefully everyone has seen ASCO's Road to Recovery report that was published in early December that lays out the views of a large number of ASCO volunteers who worked very hard on that regarding how clinical research and care now should be modified based on what we learned from the pandemic. One of the very arcane points in there that may actually turn out to be important has to do with the issue of protocol deviations. A concern that many oncologists have in enrolling older patients in clinical trials is whether or not they can comply with the trial requirements. And if they don't comply, does that constitute a protocol deviation that then reflects negatively on that clinical trial site or investigator? So there are, in a sense, two remedies for that. One is we need to simplify clinical trial operations so there are fewer opportunities for deviations. I think Donald Harvey mentioned that earlier. But secondly, we need to re-examine the definition of protocol deviations. Not every deviation from the protocol has the same impact or consequences either for safety or for validity of the trial data. And in fact, ASCO has decided now to take on a project to re-examine protocol deviations, try to reclassify them into deviations that are meaningful with respect to either patient safety or impact on trial validity, and basically recommend, we hope, that anything that doesn't fall into one of those buckets be reclassified as something else, not a protocol deviation that has a potential implication regarding performance on clinical trials that would be of concern to a sponsor or a regulator. So more to come on that, but sometimes it's these little things like Aishwarya mentioned that exist in clinical trials that create the biggest problems. And I'll just remind everyone, Stu Lichtman said this in his presentation the other day, we have met the enemy and they are us. Most of the things that are incorporated in clinical trials are things that we as investigators have put there, not necessarily things that are required to be there. And if we put them there, we can take them out. I just think that we really have to look very carefully at all of the elements of a trial beyond the eligibility criteria and figure out how to simplify the trials to make them more accessible.
Thank you. Harpreet, I'm wondering if there have been any steps made at the FDA, during the pandemic to change your processes.
Yeah, no, we've done an immense amount of work in this space. I think we were the first regulatory agency in March to put out a guidance on basically how industry and investigators could modify their trials to keep patients safe. I think one thing that a lot of people thought was that we did not allow this before for trials with registrational intent, that you could not do virtual visits, that you could not ship patients medications. And that was never the case. In fact, we'd encouraged it publicly, privately, particularly oncology, where sometimes it's hard to find patients with rare molecular mutations or so forth. But the pandemic really forced ongoing trials to kind of pivot and and modify their registration trials accordingly. And now we're starting to see these trials actually coming in. And to the point about, protocol deviations, we're expecting to see a ton. And we won't penalize sponsors for this. We're expecting them, and they're only called deviations because that wasn't the prospective plan, to basically decentralize or hybridize the trial. But I do think inherently, the idea behind industry-sponsored trials, and maybe Eric can comment on this too, it is like a de-risk or kind of a risk-averse strategy, I think it tends to be. And there is, I think, a concern about data integrity, integrity of the trial when you kind of introduce all of these modifications. I think what you'll see in the next year or so, and we've already started working on this, is saying, okay, you did have to, modify your trials to keep patients safe. And how did that impact the quality of the data, the missingness of the data? Are we still able to interpret, your primary, secondary endpoint safety, and then really disseminate that? So I think the great good and bad thing is that this data that we're getting in is the worst it's ever going to be, right? It can't get any worse than the data that's coming in now, because now we can take it, learn from it, flip it around, and say prospectively, do this to safely decentralize your trial. This is how you should capture the data. But there are several issues, like the 1572 form, and we could talk about this for days, and I think there are other workshops that do. It's not just like, the trials are decentralized, it's fixing everything. But I do think it's an ongoing conversation, and we're super involved in this, and I think we can only go up from here.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on this COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Larissa. From a clinical standpoint, as our hospital began to fill up with COVID cases, it became imperative for the Cancer Institute to try to keep our patients out of the hospital. And one of the things that we did was simply require that all frail patients be presented at something like Tumor Board. We developed, it was an extension of our palliative care conference to reassess people's goals of care. And like Ishwarya said, I think that in a way, COVID made us give better care. I really thought we should be reassessing goals of care. I just want to link that to your comment about looping in primary care, which I think is so important. One of the important things that came out of the oncology care model was the use of the IOM care plan, the 13 points, one of which is patient goals of care. And I think that that a goals of care discussion or a care plan could go beyond OCM into oncology, into other specialties, and into primary care.
Great, thank you so much for that. If no one else has any comments on COVID and lessons learned, then I will turn this over to Gwen.
Great, thank you, Larissa. And Harpreet put something in the chat box that I wanted to see if follow up on, and then I'll and she said, Eric, can you comment on how industry may view decentralized trials? Is there an enthusiasm? If not, how can we help?
Well, yeah. So Harpreet, you mentioned this. I think like a lot of things. Again, it's new, and as you say, there might be concern that this is bringing in an element of risk. But I think, as has been discussed with COVID, we've had to learn to deal with it, and I think that find ways where we are allowing. There's sort of less control than we might otherwise want, and are finding that that's not compromising the integrity of the trial. So I think I do think there would be openness to this, especially, again, as you say, FDA is not standing in the way here, and I'm not sure that all of my industry colleagues are aware that this is something that would be okay from an FDA perspective.
Great, thank you, Eric. I wanted to see whether Harpreet wanted to come to say anything in response to that.
No, I think we should and can do a better job of letting industry know. And again, it has only come up with these very small populations that tend to be hard to reach, but I think extrapolating these concepts to just broader clinical trial drug development would be great. One thing from an industry perspective that we have heard feedback about that requires another layer is other regulatory authorities in other parts of the world, because all drug development is global, and or most, I'll say 90% of it in oncology. And so if the FDA and US academicians and US based organizations are advocating for something, but only 20% or less of that clinical trial population is US enrolled, well, then industry may kind of run up against, well, how do we harmonize this against the rest of the world and EMA and TGA and Health Canada? I think that's another kind of action item or a work stream that may need to come out of not only the decentralized trial aspects, but also the cancer and older adult piece.
Great, thank you. So I was just going to make a little segue comment, which is we were talking, Ishwarya was talking about how in some ways that you are treating patients in a more holistic and more satisfying manner for both the patients and the healthcare providers. And I think, we've done a lot of research around patient experience, and the patient healthcare provider, it's usually physician relationship, the primacy of that can't be underestimated. And I think that can't be underestimated, to go back to Rich, in terms of clinical trials as well. My dad is a retired internist, and when I was a kid, he made house calls all the time. He knew his patients, he saw his patients, he knew their families. And so getting to know more than just the patient, but also getting to know their families and their caregivers and seeing how and how they live gives you a lot of insight into people, but also it doesn't just give you an insight, it also helps build that relationship. So it may feel counterintuitive that you can build a relationship over a virtual form and actually have it be slightly more satisfying. I think that's one of the things we found in this pandemic. I'm not, I will tell you, as a extrovert and epic hugger, I am not ready to give up the in-person, but I think that we can look and see what can be blended and how we can blend this going forward. So one of the things I thought maybe we could use in our final minutes is building on something that both Rich and Don Harvey said. Don Harvey talked about, one of the solutions was to simplify, simplify, simplify. And Rich said, we've seen the enemy, and the enemy is ourselves. And many of the things that we've put in, we clinicians have put in, they can take out. And so what do we do? What kind of action can we do to simplify this so that we can get to so that we can really get to building this evidence base and take away those barriers that have been put in maybe unnecessarily? Rich?
I think we are starting to see some movement in that direction. As I think everyone knows, when ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research issued its first round of recommendations on simplifying eligibility criteria, which is back now in October 2017, there are a couple of follow-ons that flowed from that. One is that NCI modified their clinical trial protocol template to include those modified eligibility criteria for NCI-sponsored clinical trials. And FDA, I guess last year, issued several guidance documents that essentially made the same recommendations to industry. So now what we have to do is to say, okay, a major funder of clinical trials and the primary regulator of clinical trials have endorsed broadening eligibility criteria. Is it happening? It's to some extent going to be up to NCI reviewers and FDA reviewers as they see proposals for trials to call out the trial sponsor on this and to hold them to adhering to the recommended modifications, unless there is a strong rationale for not doing so. We've heard from NCI that they're beginning to bring up these issues in their reviews. I think FDA is also beginning to bring up these issues in their reviews. There still is a gap between what can be brought up in review and what can be required before the trial is allowed to move forward. And maybe Harpreet can comment on that. There is a whole new set of recommendations on further broadening eligibility criteria and simplifying trial operations that is going to be published on February 9th in a series of manuscripts that will come out in Clinical Cancer Research. Donald and maybe others on this call participated in generating some of those. So that'll be the next phase. And we hope that those will lead to subsequent further FDA guidance to support those recommendations.
Harpreet, did you want to make a comment? Or you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. I think the modernizing eligibility criteria effort has been very successful. I mean, we do look at every protocol and we ask the sponsor to justify, why are you excluding these patients? Does this make sense? But a lot of times they do it automatically. They're including patients with HIV, brain metastases where appropriate. I just don't think it's enough, right, to address this problem. I think it's like chipping away at, it's saying, okay, well, they're eligible. We're not excluding patients who have a little bit of renal dysfunction or who, one recommendation I'm really looking forward to in this new set of guidances is the ECOG-2, because I do think that that's something we see, we have commented on, and there are some disease areas in which certainly like small cell where patients present very, very poor performance status because of their disease. But just throughout oncology, I think there's a lot of fudge factor there with ECOG. And so that coming out in formal guidance, I do think has direct applicability as well to this conversation. But I think we've made immense progress on this issue.
Great. Thank you, Harpreet. And I'm looking at my computer, the timer on my computer. I'm like, we have 7 minutes left for the session. So I know Larissa has another question that she wants to ask, and there have been some, there is an active chat. So I'm going to turn it back to Larissa to ask the final question and call in the final comments.
Yeah, hard to believe that we've been chatting for this long and we can continue going. So, I mean, when I listen to the presentations over the sessions that we heard, and the successful trials were presented, what occurred to me is that the successful trials were carried out by people who wanted to make them happen. And it was by no accident that these successful trials were successful trials. And so my question really pertains to the champions in geriatric oncology. And so clearly, I mean, the field has benefited a lot by many of the champions who are on this call. And, of course, I can't not mention Arthi Hiria, who really, championed this field tremendously, Harvey Cohen and others. And so my question, and I guess I'll just, because we have limited time, I'll ask Ishwari and Heidi to comment on how do we drive more investigator development into the field of geriatric oncology, and how do we do this not 10 years from now, but how do we do this in the near immediate future?
So, Heidi, you want to go?
No, go ahead.
You're absolutely right, Larissa. I mean, Efrat Dotan spent no less than 7 years to get her remarkable study up and running. And so the fact that it is a passion more than a job is very clear in the geriatric oncology community. The number one motivator for everyone should be that, God willing, eventually you will be an older adult. And statistically speaking, someone in your immediate circle is going to need cancer care. And so for better or worse, please lay out the landscape so that when you need to access it, it's in ideal form. The second one is ensuring that there are very public funding opportunities dedicated to older adult study. And I mean, saying out loud that we want studies that are centered around older adults, that promote all dimensions of care for the older adult And the more the merrier. You can never have too many. And the third is something that I think of in the context of, primary palliative care versus subspecialty palliative care. I'm a palliative care clinician. There are sets of skills that are universal to every practicing clinical provider. And then there are sets of skills that are unique to those subspecialty trained in that field, whether it's geriatrics or palliative care or whatever it may be. The familiarity and comfort with the basic components of the geriatric assessment is primary geriatrics. That needs to be in the comfort zone of every oncologic provider out there across the multidisciplinary team. So that being said, the education of subspecialty providers is critical, as is the level of comfort for every single clinician. Now, when it comes to study design, the hesitation for innovation, we have to get over that. Whatever the culture is in your individual department, in your IRB, on your ad board, in your company, or whatever it may be, immediately get over that, because we have seen innovative models being presented over the previous sessions. If you missed them, look at the recordings, listen to Jack Lee, listen to Don Harvey, Michael Maitland. They're out there and they can be done. So get over the hesitation for innovation and engage the expertise. You by yourself don't have to become a geriatrician. You can get people on board who will advise thoughtful study design that takes into account measures of the geriatric assessment, patient-reported outcomes, whatever it may be. So all doable with existing resources.
So I
Great,
just
thank
had
you.
a,
Yeah,
I just
go
wanted
ahead.
to add just a couple things. I completely agree with everything Aishwarya said. And again, emphasizing the importance of investigator-initiated funding opportunities for those interested in cancer and aging research. So important. I think the incubators for conducting and developing research studies in cancer and aging, places like, as was mentioned, the Alliance, Cancer in the Older Adult Group, we have at each of SWOG, ECOG, every group now has a dedicated set of either a committee or a subcommittee or a group or a working group that's working on clinical trial design and the opportunity to provide leadership opportunities for those early career faculty. Those are places where they can get their footing. So I think those are really, really critical. And I also want to mention, we'd be remiss not to mention the Cancer and Aging Research Group. So this is the national organization that Arthi Huria developed from her K Award. Her K Award developed a massive grassroots national group that pretty much all cancer and aging researchers in this country are engaged in. So we have calls every 2 weeks. All the experts who are now champions, who are growing champions, are on those calls. And so that's a resource now. The infrastructure is there for anyone, whether it's someone from industry, whether it's collaborators at institutions or the community setting, to send your inquiries in so you can get that advice from experts in real time on our infrastructure. We have a measures committee, a health services committee, a communications committee. So please check out the website. That's where all of the sort of action is, and we're trying to mentor and trying to engage and network. We have networks with, of course, all the stakeholders throughout the country. So please look at that, because that's available now and will continue to grow.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And so unfortunately, while I would love to be able to continue to chat with all of you and to hear from our audience participants, we do need to close this session. So thank you all so much for this really exciting discussion. And I think that we will be able to walk away with some steps for the future. And so now I will turn this over to Monica to summarize all of the sessions and plan ahead. So Monica, back to you.